talk today a little bit about some of the generative artwork that I've been doing over the past, 25 years or so. And in particular, I'm going to talk about computed paintings. So when I say computed paintings, I use the term computed paintings to describe images that are generated by some relatively simple algorithmic processes involving no user input and no random data generation to generate the final image. That is, the algorithm fully describes the image that you get out at the end. Now, of course, there are many ways that one could generate computed paintings based on this definition, and I've explored a few of them. One of the most interesting that I've found is based on the idea of sequential geometric transformations of simple starting forms or simple starting shapes. And as I said, this is a project I've been working on for a long time. In particular, the geometric transformations methodology dates back to probably 2002 when I started really discovering the variety of things that can be achieved with this kind of approach. And so in this talk, I'll show how images as varied as the ones shown here can be generated from a single family of equations and a single sort of approach to an algorithm, and how I ended up generating over 300,000 such images and reviewing 300,000 such images over about a 5-year period of fairly intensive work on this. So just taking a step back, what do I mean by a geometric transformation? As many of you will know, a geometric transformation just maps points on a graph, if you will, or in a shape from one location to another. So shown here, ironically, France is the example that's on Wikipedia. You can do a reflection of the image of France, and by doing so, which you can describe with the parametric equation shown here at the bottom, and by doing so, you change the orientation of the shape that you started with, right? So you map the points on the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And as for all geometric transformations, reflection has a characteristic effect on the shapes that were present in the starting image. Certain aspects of the geometry are preserved, in this case almost all of them, with the exception of orientation, which is changed. And other, as I said, other aspects of the geometry or the geometric features are altered. So this kind of simple transformation, a reflection, preserves what we would normally think of as the symmetry of the image as well. And we'll come back to symmetry, preservation versus destruction or changing of symmetries. Now, you can see geometric transformations quite frequently in decorative arts, right? You encounter this all over the place. You see motifs being translated and repeated to decorate the borders of images. You see rotations. Sometimes they're slightly hidden, but if you think about it, you can see a rotation such as this, where the upper image is rotated to give the lower. And you can see reflections. This is a picture I took down in the 7th arrondissement of a nice building. So this kind of approach of taking a motif and repeatedly modifying it by some simple geometric transformation certainly fits into what's normally considered part of art, or the decorative arts at the very least. And sometimes you get slightly more complex transformations. If you look around, this lower right-hand image is one that I found as part of a China pattern at the second-hand store the other day. And this one actually is an affine transformation, so it's changing the size of the whole motif, as well as rotating it as it moves from place to place in the design. So still, though, those are fairly simple geometric transformations. There are more complex ones out there. And as illustrated on the bottom, you can stretch and distort an image in lots of different ways with this approach. So another one of these geometric transformations that is pretty well known, sort of high school level mathematics, that is one of my particular favorites and is heavily used in the work I'm going to show you, is the polar coordinate transformation. So the polar coordinate transformation converts the Cartesian coordinate system to the polar coordinate system, so that in this particular instantiation, horizontal lines become rays emanating from the center of the image, and horizontal lines become circles, vertical lines become rays. You can do it the other way around if you tweak the mathematics. And so the equation is shown at the bottom of the slide for how you can produce this kind of a transformation. Now, this one has a very different profile of what geometric properties are maintained or altered when you put a particular shape or an image through this coordinate transformation, right? Distances between points certainly altered, orientations certainly altered, angles between lines, well, it depends on what lines you're talking about. Some are preserved and some are maintained, right? The axes are still perpendicular, where in Cartesian coordinates you're talking about horizontal and vertical. Here you're talking about circular and radial, but still perpendicular to each other at all points. Okay, so if you take that concept, the repetition of motifs and the application of sequential geometric transformations, you can play around with that, and you can take something like a circle and apply multiple instances of the geometric transformation to that. And I spent a long time sort of enjoying the possibilities there and making lots of different images from different starting motifs and different sort of visualizations, some of which are shown here. So you can play with rotating the motif when it's been partially transformed and things like this. So here's a few examples of some of the early work that I did here. Here's another one where the motifs are overlapped in the final image. But again, you can see, if you look carefully, the application of the polar coordinate transformation having stretched and distorted some fairly simple starting shapes. If you add some sort of identifiable motif like this six-branched star that's shown in this one, it sort of highlights how this original image, which was very simple, symmetrical, radially symmetrical motif, gets transformed through the application of these transformations over and over again. Okay, so that's polar coordinate transformation and maybe a little bit of rotation or reflection. Those are kind of nice. There are some close relatives to the polar coordinate transformation that one can bring into play as well. So if you start with the checkerboard pattern, labeled number 1 in this image, you can apply the polar coordinate transformation and you get image number 2. You can apply the inverse polar coordinate transformation, which is just the reverse process, as you'd expect, to get image number 3. And we'll skip number 4 for now, but you can also do what's called a circle inversion sometimes to get image number 5, again, directly from image number 1. And it turns out that image number 5 is also the result of executing an inverse polar coordinate transformation, so getting to image number 3, flipping the image vertically, and then applying the polar coordinate transformation. So undoing the polar coordinate transform, having flipped the image in between, you end up with image number 5. And so that, again, is a theme that informed a lot of the later work, that if you first do one of these symmetry breaking operations and then do some symmetry preserving operations and finally undo the symmetry breaking operation, you end up with an image that has a relationship with the original but is certainly different. And so, again, working with some of these transformations to sort of with free-form application and starting with manually selected images, we get to some images like this, that some of which are shown in the gallery, in the exhibit that's in the tubes in the buildings here, between the buildings here. And obviously there's a family of things based on this particular motif and color scheme and so on. This is a result of sort of a distorted circle inversion. And so one can spend a lot of time enjoying that kind of work. But sort of the computer science scientist part of me wanted to do sort of a more systematic exploration of what are the possibilities of this kind of geometric operation, right? So for example, if you take something as simple as a square with a white border, a black square with a white border, and you repeatedly apply the polar coordinate transformation to that shape, what you get ultimately in the limit of this operation is the attractor of this equation, of this function, right? So repeated operation here, we're showing this sort of dead Pac-Man on his back is the first application of polar coordinate transform. The second application adds another involution and so on until eventually we end up at the what approximates the attractor of this function on the right-hand side. Similarly, for the inverse function, here we're starting with a white square with a black border, but the same process can be done where doing the inverse polar coordinate transform repeatedly leads eventually through these sort of plant-like images to something that again shows in white where the attractor for this image or for this function lies. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here is that with repeated application of the same transformation over and over and over again, we get the characteristic spirals and self-similarity that you see in fractals, where, again, you're applying sort of the same function an infinite number of times in that case, or at least theoretically infinite number of times, and you get that characteristic self-similarity and spiral activity. And that's nice, but I don't know, it's kind of sterile in my mind. But what if you take this symmetry breaking operation, the polar coordinate transformation, and you add one of these symmetry preserving operations, and then you sort of extend the loop? So now our process is take an image, do the polar coordinate transformation, rotate the result, and then start over. So rather than just doing the same thing on every transformation, we now have a pair of transformations that we're going to alternate between. And so this, of course, yields a slightly different, or eventually quite different set of attractors. And so shown here on the images are the application of 10 through 60 degree rotations as the rotation step in this process. Obviously, there's something else going on here as well. There's a visualization component to how this is being done. So in this case, we start with a set of vertical lines. We apply the polar coordinate transformation. We end up with and this is a slightly different formulation than the original, but anyway. So we end up with circles, right? So you can see, actually, in the background, at least for those of you who have good eyesight or are sitting close, that the first iteration is still there. There's a sort of set of circular nest of concentric circles that are present in all of these images from the first application of the polar coordinate. And, of course, rotation does nothing to circles, so they stay the same. And then, if you look even closer, you can see where those circles map to when you apply that set of operations a second time. So there's a very light outline of another set of lines here. And then as you keep going forward, the whole thing contracts down towards, again, the attractor of this particular function. I mean, it's a two-step function, but it's still just one equation, really. And you can obviously see the familial similarity between different amounts of rotation being inserted into this process. And so, again, you can kind of work with these types of functions, this sort of operation. This color image here is a composite of 4 different functions of this sort of type, put together to please me, and with a background. And then in the lower left, you can see another way of visualizing this same sort of operation, where instead of adding a set of lines each time, we're adding a translucent gray overlay so that wherever the function moves the gray points towards becomes darker and darker on successive applications of the process. So the attractor now is the black area, and you can see the various steps in shades of gray. But again, this is fairly repetitive, right? We're just doing the same thing over and over and over again, rotating by a certain amount, applying the polar coordinate transform, or flipping the image and applying the polar coordinate transform. And there's a limited number of possibilities there to a certain degree. If you start thinking about systematically exploring all the possible space, though, you don't have to do the same transformation every time, right? You could, for example, take a different rotation each time through the algorithm. And so some of the images shown here exemplify that. So now, instead of doing the polar coordinate transformation and rotation by a certain amount, we're picking the amount of rotation differently for each of these columns with the R above them. So here we're rotating by, say, 75 degrees, and then here we're rotating by, say, 180 degrees. And so if you approach the application of these geometric transformations in that manner, suddenly there are quite a few possibilities. You'll also notice that it doesn't tend to matter in the end what shape you start with. You start with a circle, a pentagon, an X shape. They all kind of lose their original features by the time you've applied even, 6 steps. So I pretty much stopped changing what the initial image was at this stage and just went with a square from here on out. So pretty much everything that you'll see is these geometric transformations applied to something very simple like a square. So what you start with almost makes no difference at all. So if you think about a vector that describes the set of geometric transformations that we're going to apply here, you can look at it as we're going to choose a symmetry breaking operation, such as polar, inverse polar, or circle inversion. And then we're going to choose a rotation, and we'll alternate between those two steps, choosing our rotation in some manner. And you can end up with, you can notate that as sort of P1R1, P2R2, and so on. That you can think of that as a vector, or later on we'll think of it as a genome for that particular image, right? It fully describes, with the rest of the algorithm in place, how to create the particular image that we're getting to. And so on the bottom two images, we have the results of polar 135-degree rotation followed by polar 30-degree rotation repeated 4 times. If you could show movie number 1, please. So if you have a vector that goes through, then obviously that describes a space with n dimensions. And so you can think about traversing that space by changing one of the dimensions, the rotation in one of the dimensions, and calculating an image at each small increment of rotation. And so doing that, you can see that there's actually quite a wide variety of different shapes, or at least it seemed to me, quite a wide variety of different shapes that are generated from fairly small changes in how the image is constructed, right? And so that, of course, when you start going back to thinking about a systematic exploration, leads to a combinatorial explosion, right? If you try and enumerate every single possible squiggle that you could get out of this system, you're rapidly going to fill your hard drive. And I generated, a few tens of thousands of these things, and then it's like, okay, wait, this is ridiculous. I can't look at them all. But what I did discover was that there is, as I say, at least to my eye, lots of variety, and you cannot say that just by looking at a few hundred of these things, you've seen all of them. So what do we do about that? Well, what we're faced with is a very large parameter space, right? If you think about this vector that we're talking about constructing, or the genome of this particular image, we've got now a very large high-dimensional parameter space. In fact, at that point when I was working with this thing, I figured that there were probably 10 to the 25th possible images that one might construct here. And so obviously we need to look at a subset. How do we find the interesting images? How do we find the ones that are different from each other? There's a lot of possibilities. You could think about clustering the vectors or doing something like that. There's lots of work in chemistry, actually, on how you cover a very high dimensional space to sample it well. But the take-home message from all that work typically is you can't. So the approach that I took was to try a genetic algorithm. So we start with 1,000 random sequences, make visualizations of each of the images that result from those sequences, review and score each one based on my personal feeling about whether it was interesting or novel or attractive, and then take pairs of those images and recombine them, weighted for the score that was attributed to them, and generate a new generation and recycle. So here's a pipeline pilot protocol that I wrote to generate an initial set of 1,000 or so diverse starting points for doing this kind of exploration. So in this particular protocol, we generate 10 times as many random sequences with the first two components as the ultimate number of images that we want to generate in the first generation. And then we filter out any duplicates using one of the components that's built into the system. And then we use a clustering algorithm to, as I was talking about earlier, find the centroids of the vector space where these randomly dropped points are in this high-dimensional space, so that we try to cover as much of that space as possible with this first 1,000 images so that we're accessing, as much of the space, as many different kinds of images as possible. So we cluster them with average cluster size of 7, and we output only the centroids of the clusters, and this becomes our initial sort of set of images that we're going to work from. Now, having done that, of course, we got to figure out how we want to render these things. There's lots of different ways that I've experimented with. I've talked about a few of these. Obviously, you can just do black and white. You can do colored versions of the rendering, starting with a colored square, which I'll show more about in a second. You can do this sort of grayscale layers approach. You can switch to blue scale, right? That makes it kind of more interesting in some ways. You could do a color swatch and then layer that over top each time, and you can end up with some interesting results that way, as shown in the lower left. What's interesting about starting with a colored square where the different locations in the initial image have different colors is that you can track back from the final image to where that pixel actually started out its life, right? So you know that anything that's orange started out in the top right-hand corner of this image. So when you get down to the bottom and you can see the sort of, the abdomen of the guy down there in the lower right is orange, you know that that's where that particular part came from. So you can show movie number 2, please. So this is another traversal of the parameter space for a particular group of these images generated by these vectors. And the movie pauses at the particular sort of keyframes that were images that I had found in exploring some of this parameter space, and then animated between. And in this case, we're not traversing sort of Manhattan style, that is one dimension at a time, but rather going as the crow flies through the vector space, so changing lots of different rotation vectors all at once. So just more different ways of visualizing these kinds of things, and especially as you get into relatively long sequences of transformations. So the one on the left, I think, is the result of 28 transformations sequenced together, and each time adding a sort of a veneer of sort of a rainbow of pink and yellow on top of what was already there. And on the right-hand side is a similar approach. This one on the right-hand side takes more advantage of what I call chop, squash, duplicate, which sort of takes an image, cuts a piece of it away, squishes it down into half of the image, and then duplicates it. So that actually is a symmetry generating operation, where before we were talking about symmetry preserving or symmetry breaking. If you think about reflecting something over top of what was already there, in a sense, that's a symmetry generation process. Okay, so then having generated 1,000 or so images in a generation, I need a way to review them and it has to be ergonomic, right? I mean, I don't want to have to open each image manually and then type in a value in an Excel sheet and figure out which row it belongs on and all this sort of stuff. So I wrote another pipeline pilot protocol to automate this process. And so what this protocol does is it goes to the most recent generations folder. It sort of looks in the master folder and finds the largest numbered generation that exists, lists out all the images that are there with the list files component filtered on .png, makes one page worth so that I can fit it into a browser page, which I found that 50 images at a time was a good amount to work on. And then we go into the sub-protocol that's boxed there. So at this stage of the pipeline, we move down here. And here we actually use some of the imaging component collection, which was one of the things that I worked on when I first joined the company. So I was pleased to use that to read in the image and put it into a web page accessible format. We join from our database of sequences what the actual sequence that generated this image was, so that if you want to look at it if I wanted to look at it while I was rating the images, I could see what the actual sequence was, although I did debate with myself about whether it was a good idea to show that or to hide it so that I would be unbiased by what the equation was. I opted for showing it in the end. And then we add some form elements that allow easy addition by the user, me, of what the rating is. So in this case, all you have to do is hit a number key and then hit tab, and it jumps you down to the next list element on the page, and it's formatted in such a way that jumps you down one entire page and shows you exactly just the one next image that you have to rate. So it becomes fairly fast and ergonomic, so you just hit the key and hit tab, and you can go through these things quite rapidly, which is important if you're trying to do thousands and thousands of them. And this is what the user interface looks like, and this is rescaled to make the point here. But so here's 3 images from a relatively recent run, and then the user interface elements shows you the number of the image, the transformations that were applied to get there, and then your list box of available ratings, and then where that image is on disk. I've never really needed that, but it's there. And when you get all done rating all the images in the generation, then the system goes back and it gives you some statistical analysis of what the ratings for this particular generation were. How did different lengths of sequence affect what you thought of the images? How many 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, etc. did you give? And which were the actual geometric transformations that were associated with the highest rated images, that sort of thing. So that's kind of interesting. Again, getting back to how you want to visualize these things, you can, because the transformation proceeds in steps, it's not just one equation, but the nested functions are actually executed sequentially. You can display the antecedent images for any final image. So shown on the left-hand side, this black and white image is immediately preceded, the large one is immediately preceded by the one on the lower right, in the smaller image. And you can see, you can guess that this is an inverse polar coordinate transformation that results in sort of unwinding this circular shape into a flattened out or unrolled shape. Whereas that lower right circular image comes from a polar coordinate transformation of the preceding image and so on. And then on the right-hand side, you can see all, whatever it is, 42 steps that take you from a black square with a rainbow background all the way through to whatever this looks like to you. And I don't know, to me it looks like a strange tree on a cloudy day or something. But so that's how you get from the very beginning all the way through to the very final image. So we've now generated some initial images. We've actually done the visualization, and we've given them a rating. Now we need to create the next generation of images. And so here's a protocol that does that. So we read all the ratings data, and then we apply a weighting. In this case, I was actually just taking the cube of the rating that was given for every image, and then we make sort of a pool of parent images, right? Parent sequences. You can think of them as genomes, right? So these are the genomes of all the parents that are available for every new image that you want to generate. And then we, in pipeline number 2 here, we generate however many records we want to create new images, and we pick 2 parents just by, here's where we do some random operations here, but just to pick the parents from the pool, right? So they're weighted, and we just pick one image or one pair of images from the pool. We get the sequences for those 2 images in the 2 join operations, and then we put them together to make a new sequence. And I'll show a bit about how that's done in a second. The next thing we do is we make sure that we aren't duplicating an image. So again, the first occurrence filter to make sure that the code that I'm going to make is not duplicated in this set. And then also there's another join data from master cache component here. So this is just a join component that looks in the database of all the images based on their codes that have been generated before, and make sure that I'm not repeating anything that had been done in an earlier generation. So anything that passes, right, anything that has a match gets filtered out. Anything that fails, that's a new thing, so we can go ahead and create that. So then we add them to the database and visualize statistical properties of the new set. Here's a little bit of the code that actually does some of the key steps in calculating the new sequence of transforms from the old sequence of transforms. This calculates the length of what our new sequence is going to be, because, of course, the genomes aren't necessarily the same size, right? So the vectors aren't necessarily the same size for any 2 images. So we calculate a split point. We take the first part of parent number 1, and we take the second part of parent number 2. We stick them together, and that's our child sequence. Very simple. In order to make sure that we didn't get caught in local minima or in a rut, right? That we didn't have inbreeding. I added some mutation and drift to these sequences. So this is instantiated in 3 different ways. So we have drift for continuous operations, right? So something like rotation, you could imagine drifting from polar and then a 30-degree rotation to a polar and then a 40-degree rotation. So this is going to give you a similar image, but not exactly the same, right? And certainly the earlier it is in the process, the less recognizable as a close relative it may end up being. You can have mutation, particularly useful for transformations that are discrete, right? So polar, inverse polar, circle inversion, these sorts of things. You can't really drift from one to the other, you just have to jump. So, for example, shown below, you could have polar and then a horizontal flip, or you could have an inverse polar and then a horizontal flip. And these can make quite a large difference. And so we employ these, or I employ these with diminishing frequency as the changes get more radical. And then, of course, you can just extend the sequence by tacking on a random one at the end of the genome of the child. So here's an image of a final created image on the right-hand side, so a particular image that was generated, and then its parents, shown just to the left and slightly smaller, half size. The grandparents, shown one column left of that, and half the size, and the great-grandparents and the great-great-grandparents, and so on. So all the way back till you have, I don't know, whatever it is, 6 generations here of predecessor images or ancestor images that were combined together through various generations to produce this image all the way on the right-hand side. And you can kind of see, as you go from the largest image and follow the lowermost branch, that there's a real family resemblance among these images, right? But they've brought in elements from the other images that they were crossed with. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at these things. As I said, I looked at a lot of these images, hundreds of thousands over a long period. And after a while, you do start to see that maybe you've seen what there is to see, right? There's a lot of possibilities, but they definitely come in families. So you can see repeated motifs here cropping up over and over again. And maybe it's because I was ruling out things that I didn't find interesting or attractive. But after a while, I did find that it was getting fairly repetitive. And so there wasn't much new in my eye coming out of the system. And so there was nowhere to go but up, right? I mean, this is all two-dimensional stuff. There is, of course, the possibility that instead of doing polar coordinate transformation, you could do some 3D coordinate transformations. And so again, using Pipeline Pilot and in this case the persistence of vision ray tracing freeware application, you can extend from doing planar transformations of a square to 3-space transformations of a cube. So there are some very direct analogies as far as what transformations are available and some new possibilities that crop up. So for example, the spherical transform doesn't really have an analog in 2 dimensions. And likewise, the inverse spherical, those are kind of extensions that are wholly different from what you can do in 2 dimensions. The polar coordinate transform really is quite analogous, can be easily mapped to the cylindrical transform, right? You just keep one of the dimensions constant and do a polar transform on everything. And likewise, the inverse polar and the circle inversion can be inverse cylindrical and cylinder inversion. So we have basically twice as many coordinate transforms now as we did before. And likewise, the symmetry preserving operations can be done against all the different axes, right? So that, again, even widens further the realm of possibilities of what one can do. And you can see down at the bottom here some of the single transformation operations. So the leftmost is the spherical coordinate transform, starting from a cube that doesn't quite fill the range where we're going to do this operation. And then the cylindrical, inverse spherical, and the sphere inversion. And, of course, you can do this same sort of systematic exploration of the space. If you take the spherical transform and follow it by a rotation by pi/6 along the x-axis, if you apply that 2 times, you come to the lower left image. 3 times, 4 times, 6 times, and 10 times, you get to some fairly distorted and kind of difficult to visualize final geometries here, but kind of interesting and at least to my mind, very sort of organic, right? The way that these shapes become distorted and pushed and pulled, kind of like taffy or something like that. So back to how this is done. Here's a Pipeline Pilot protocol that takes the sequence of transformations, the code for a particular image, and runs it through a protocol that calculates where each starting point, which was on the surface of this cube, should end up at the end of all these operations. So we have a looping step here in the first exploded view, where we run through this once for each transformation that we need to apply. And then inside this sub-protocol, which is actually where the transformations are, there's basically a big case statement that says if the transformation's name is this, then run it through this component, which in turn actually carries out the mathematical transformation on each of the points that we're tracking. And typically I did this on about 250,000 points was enough to get reasonable resolution out of these kinds of operations. So you go through that a bunch of times until you've exhausted the sequence, and then you need to come up with some sort of visualization of this, the final output, right? Just looking at it as an array of points is not very entertaining. So this final sub-protocol takes the data that we've generated and generates something that's actually renderable out of that. In this case, it sets it up for rendering with the persistence of vision ray tracing application. And we generate a surface mesh for where the surface of this cube ended up, as well as some cylinders that highlight every 10th row or that sort of thing, and then points which are represented as spheres, which are sort of in the stood off a little bit from the surface, which are the normal to the surface at that particular point, or a little bit along the normal vector. So you can end up with images like the one shown on the left-hand side here, having gone through a large sequence of these transformations, showing the normals and where the surface of this cube ended up after having been squashed and stretched and put through the taffy machine, if you will. One of the other things that I found fun to do takes advantage of another capability of the Pipeline Pilot sort of generic components, which is the data clustering. So take the normals here, so this set of points that are, again, stood off from the surface by a little distance along the normal vector. In the final calculated result, so after we've put it through all these transformations, we take these normals and we cluster them. So we take the whole set and cluster them up into groups of 8 to 20 or so, and we take the centroids of those clusters and cluster them in turn, and so on up the chain. And then if you illustrate that with connections between the points, you can see in this detail image on the right-hand side, which shows the rectangularly selected area on the left, how various regions can sort of be broken down or divided up sort of hegemonically into zones. So I went through lots and lots of images like this, and eventually decided that it would be fun to look at some traversals of the parameter space in 3 dimensions, if I was just patient enough for all the calculations to take place. Wrote another protocol that would sift through all of the sequences and find ones that sort of went together, right? Because the discrete transformations, right, the polar, the inverse polar, the spherical coordinate transforms, those things, they really need to be in the same place in the sequence in order for the movie to be smooth and not have jumps, right? If you jump from spherical to inverse spherical, the whole image is gonna switch in the middle. So if you want to play movie number 3, this is at 30 frames per second, 45 seconds times 200 by 200 by 6 sides on the original cube. Something like 1 billion vertices have to be calculated in order to generate this animation. So this required a little bit of patience, but for some of them, the result was quite pleasing and worth the wait, I felt. There are more movies like that, as you might imagine. I have a YouTube channel. Okay, so a little bit early, but future directions. So there are still some operations that I have not implemented in 3 dimensions that I thought were particularly interesting in 2 dimensions, in particular this sort of chop, squash, duplicate operation that generates symmetries to add to the ones that preserve and destroy symmetries. Another thing that might be nice would be adaptive mesh resolution. So right now, the distance between points is fixed at the beginning, and so as some regions get stretched, there are some very large panels, if you will, on the surface that gets generated, and it would be nice to add more resolution in those areas as we go through the stages. Longer, higher quality movies, yeah, that's just a matter of patience. Rendering, of course, is always something you can spend an infinite amount of time trying to figure out what would make these things really look nice. A lot of the renderings that I've done are really designed to show what the shape is, more than be necessarily particularly aesthetically pleasing. And so I've tried to do that a little bit. You can see in the lower center panel here, kind of trying to make it look like a real sculpture. So there's that. But then that brings me to 3D printing of some of these surfaces and volumes. So if we're starting with a cube and we're distorting it in various ways, it should be possible in the end to take that data and represent it in such a way that an additive printing approach can be applied to actually print some of these three-dimensional things out, and then you'd be able to look at them from all sides. And I think that would be a lot of fun. I'm going to work on that with the Fab Lab, but there's a lot of things that need to be fixed, I think, in my geometry before it's ready to be printed. And then the other thing that I've toyed with and almost have ready is a continuous generation online rating app. So all the pipeline pilot protocols generate web pages that the user, me, interacts with, and so it's actually possible to set it up so that every time one image is rated, another one gets generated, right? So you take you make it from a batch process into a flow process, a continuous process, so that as more ratings get done, you look at the most recent n images that have been rated, and you recombine a pair of those based on their ratings weighting, and then generate a new image. So as long as you stay ahead of people that are doing the rating, you could play this game forever, really, and keep going. Okay. One last slide. I want to just acknowledge Julie Bosson and Catherine Cousin for helping me put this together. Julie for the inspiration to actually do it and talk about this stuff and put the exhibit together in the tubes, and Catherine for actually making it happen. And if you are interested in more info or you want to work on stuff like this, I'm always looking for people to collaborate with. That's my email address. I have a web page, of course, and like I said, a YouTube channel where more of these videos can be found. So thank you very much. And if anyone has questions, I'll be happy to talk more about any of these things. Yeah.
You find some animals coming out of this generation, like early animals, trilobites?
I did see some forms that were reminiscent of what looked to me like some of the shapes of early animals. I think they would have to have been much earlier than trilobites. I mean, these are very simple, but some of the algorithms that lead to the way plants and animals have their morphology laid out are really quite simple, right? Based on things like Fibonacci sequence or other very elementary kinds of mathematics. So yeah, I think that there's definitely some of that in there. I did have at one stage in the rating process an additional user interface element that had a bunch of different classes that were things like birds, fish, insects, and things like that, where I was kind of lumping them into classes and trying to see whether there was pattern.
Do you think it's possible for you to work out algorithms that rate automatically?
Yeah, well, rating automatically is that's tough. You have to decide then what you're going to rate based on, right? And I have tried it, but I haven't met with much success. So, I mean, you can rate based on trying to guess what amount of complexity might be visually pleasing, right? So there are actually tools in the imaging component collection in Pipeline Pilot that would allow you to assess how many vertical and horizontal lines there are and what's the average size of regions that are separate from each other, and other things that might inform the human eye view of, is this a pleasing shape or is this boring, right? But I haven't met with a whole lot of success. But if you could come up with such a thing, then you could do the whole thing as a closed loop, and you'd just pop out some beautiful image at the end, and that would be fun. But I find for myself that a lot of the fun is going through, and every image is a new thing, right? So you always can have that experience on the next image of something really cool popping out. And that's part of what's kept me going with this, is that the rating process involves a little bit of discovery and kind of exploration of new stuff.
So which part of this work is most interesting for you?
Well, for a while, I was really engrossed with the evolutionary algorithm. That was fun to write and figure out how to optimize it so that it would really generate new stuff. I'm also enjoying kind of writing the three-dimensional coordinate transforms and figuring out what ones are out there that are interesting and useful. But it's the whole thing, you know. It's great fun. Other questions?
And I was wondering, did you also try to play with different scales? For example, using Fourier series to apply different flows to each scale and mixing them in the end?
No, I did not try that. That's an interesting idea. All of this work is based on applying the same transformation to the whole image every time. But it would be, I mean, you could try something like wavelets or something else that's sort of continuously scalable and apply something like that. That'd be interesting. I haven't tried that.
And the second question, did you also try discrete transforms like subsampling or supersampling?
I'm sorry?
Did you also try discrete transforms like subsampling or things like that to have to introduce noise or blur in the pictures?
Yeah, so the only thing that I've done that introduces sort of texture or noise into the pictures is basically start with an image that contains that or add this sort of transparent layer containing texture over top. But I haven't really explored that too much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Did you try making other people than you weighting the images and see with different people after some generations what the diversity of the image they get? Mm-hmm. If one people from another, they get completely different images or not? Yeah. I have tried to engage a couple of people to do this stuff. Until I can get the sort of online system that's sort of very user-friendly finished. It required a bit of knowledge of Pipeline Pilot and a lot of interest and perseverance. But I did have one of my colleagues at BIOVIA in San Diego, Ben Acceleris, Ivana Mikic, who is the author of some of the imaging components, build it up and run some generations on her own. But I don't think she got particularly far. But I do expect that different people would have a different idea of what constitutes interesting paths to follow. And there certainly is, particularly in the 3D space, lots and lots of potential space there. It'd be fun to see. I'll be happy to share the components. Okay. Well, thanks very much again for your time and attention.